This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On October the 23rd, our Defence and Security Studies session was addressed by retired Brigadier General Serge Labbé, who spoke about the Hamas attack on Israel of October 27, 2023, and its aftermath.
So, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. This is the October version of our expert speakers series for the Defense and Security Studies program, the RCMI, and I'm the director of that program. It's my great pleasure. And when we talk about an expert series, tonight we have a true expert. And it's my great pleasure to welcome tonight Brigadier General Serge Labbé. Now, I never really crossed paths with Brigadier General Labbé. I was too junior. I was too late. Late the Royal Regiment of Canada, late the Royal Canadian Regiment, just simply late. But I knew of General Labbé, and everything I heard about him all added up to being a person who, and I'll tell you something I heard the other day at a conference I was at, he is a person that should have been Chief of the Defense Staff, and it never happened. He may have heard of this before, or not, but it's a really great pleasure to finally meet him today. And in spite of the fact that we screwed up his accommodation request on 3 different occasions in the last week, the office finally got it all organized, and I'm happy to report that he's ensconced at the local hotel, not far apart from here. And Serge, I'm here tonight. They gave me a room, but I want to tell you, I chose to give you the space at the hotel for a very good reason. We still do not have breakfast here at the RCMI, and you're going to have a wonderful buffet breakfast tomorrow morning. So I wanted to make sure that you had that. Now, I know you've received the notice, but I don't care. I'm going to read General Labbé's bio. It could go on for pages, but I'm going to read it to you anyways. It's a very, very brief summation. So, Brigadier General Serge Labbé retired from the Canadian Army in 2008 after nearly 40 years in the regular force, having served the better part of 20 years overseas in Europe, Asia, and Africa in multinational headquarters and formations, as well as deployed on operations. His earlier years were spent in a variety of regimental command and staff positions with both the Royal 22nd Regiment and the Canadian Airborne Regiment. Later appointments and assignments included command of the Canadian Joint Force Somalia in 92 to 93, for which he was awarded the U.S. Legion of Merit, and Deputy Commander of 1st Canadian Division / Commandant Canadian Army Staff College in 94 to 96. He subsequently served in multiple NATO headquarters in Europe and abroad, to include the NATO Kosovo Force Joint Implementation Commission, 2000-2001, for which he was awarded the French Médaille de la Défense Nationale à titre exceptionnel, Echelon Or, for inter alia, stemming the Albanian insurgency in southwest Serbia, and Deputy Chief of Staff of HQ ISAF in 2004 in Kabul. His last year in uniform was as the commander of the Canadian Strategic Advisory Team in Afghanistan. That was in 2007-2008. I was in Afghanistan myself in 2008, and I was aware of this organization. Other awards include the Canadian Meritorious Service Cross for Afghanistan and the NATO Meritorious Service Medal for Balkans Caucasus. So we are very blessed tonight to have General Serge Labbé with us. And of course, he's not here to talk about his experience in Afghanistan, although he regaled us with various bits of information over dinner, which we very much enjoyed. But he has a much more recent experience to share with us, and that has to do with a visit authorized to Israel and to Gaza. And we know that this is very much in the news, and we're looking very much forward to hearing about his observations and what he has taken away from that experience, which I'm sure was extraordinary. So may I present Brigadier General Serge Labbé. Sir, please come forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So actually the hotel is much nicer than sleeping on the desert bed of the Ogaden desert in Somalia or other places that I've been. So a very comfortable accommodation, thank you very much. And I am actually very pleased, and I've told, in fact in 2013 when I went to my retirement dinner for the Royal 22nd Regiment, I told them that I had no regrets in regards to Somalia, and I was happy with the career I'd had, and that in fact I really wouldn't have wanted to become a desk jockey in Ottawa for years and years and years, culminating with a 4-star position. So it's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time here, and next time I think I'll come earlier so I can actually visit the area, because I'm interested in museums now, having been with the Great Lakes Museum since 2013, imagine an infantry officer in the Great Lakes Museum. Caveats. First of all, what I'm going to present to you today is a snapshot of what I saw and I heard back in September of 2024. Since September 2024, events in the Middle East and in Israel and in Gaza particularly has spiraled almost out of control in some areas. And so there is a real difference between what you hear on the news today, tomorrow, and what we saw and witnessed. A group of senior military individuals, people, a lot of veterans with a huge amount of combat experience, which I don't have a lot of, but I have been on operations, all witnessed, and near the end of the week concluded almost unanimously that we came up with the same result in that regard. So that's the first caveat. The second caveat is that I'm not a Middle East expert. I have spent more than 6 years of my life over in Afghanistan in various capacities, but certainly not the Middle East. And the last time I was there was last September, then before that with the National Defense College in 1989, and before that when I was 14, 6 months in Jerusalem and 6 months in Damascus. That's a long time ago. That was before the 7-Day War. So back in August of last year, 2024, I was asked to join a delegation of senior defense officials, military strategists, journalists, legal experts and advisors from the UK, the US, France, Canada, Australia, and Romania. All NATO countries except Australia, but Australia has a NATO link through other organizations. To visit Israel to gain a first-hand experience of the challenges that the country and the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, I'll use IDF from now on, have been experiencing in the 11 months since the 7th October massacre that took place on the 7th of October 2023. I wasn't their first choice, Rick Hillier was, but he was unavailable, and so it fell to me, fortunately, to be able to go on his behalf. So the visit was sponsored by the European Leadership Network, ELNET. And it was designed for our delegates to meet with high-level Israeli officials, politicians, senior officers and general officers in the IDF, as well as survivors and families of hostages. Thanks to ELNET, we were the first foreign delegation to be able to travel into Gaza since the massacre of the 7th of October 2023. Back in 2021, this is what the Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran had to say to Israel. just a very soft message. I would say pretty threatening, but obviously not reassuring. 6 armies outside of Iran that were hell-bent on destroying, annihilating, and they repeatedly use that word, the state of Israel. They see it as a cancer on the surface of the earth, and they cannot exist while Israel exists. So whilst we see some peace accord dramatically presented to us by Trump last week, there is no guarantee that, in fact, it will remain in effect. Which is not surprising because, as I mentioned, Iran's strategic objective, as well as all its proxies, is the annihilation of the state of Israel, a small nation, actually now just slightly above 10 million people, with 7.3 million of them being Jews. But what we were repeatedly told in Israel is that Israel is only phase 1 of Iran's intentions, strategic intentions. Israel is phase 1, the little Satan. Phase 2 is the West, the US being the greater Satan. And it's all part of a desire by Tehran, by others, to create a caliphate from the Middle East across North Africa to the Atlantic. So, what is Gaza? I've been to Gaza several times. Actually, I've been there 3 times. Back in '66 when I was there as a teenager, again in '89, and in Gaza City, we received presentations back in '89 on some subject in regard to Palestinians at a beautiful seaside resort. The Med is beautiful there, lovely beaches, sun shining, and you couldn't have imagined a more idyllic location. It's a small plot of land, 11 kilometers at the bottom, as you see there, by about 41 kilometers, total of 365 square kilometers. Now, Israel unilaterally pulled out of Gaza in 2005, where it had defense forces, where it had settlements that had been established in Gaza itself. Some Israelis Jews had actually settled and wanted to stay there forever. But the Prime Minister at the time decided to move out of Gaza. It was costing them too much in terms of resources and also taxing the Israeli Defense Forces. As a result, they did forcibly, in some cases, pull out all the settlements and moved out. And it was to the Fatah-run Palestinian Authority that Gaza was given to govern. But in 2006, George W. Bush, as always, the West interfering and destroying what was a relatively peaceful situation. Bush insisted there be elections. There were elections, and guess who won? Hamas won. In 2007, as a result, they took over. They assassinated most of the Palestinian Authority leadership. They subjugated and enslaved the 2.5 million Palestinians and basically ran a police state where there was no freedom of movement at all. Instead of trying to do something useful with that beautiful beachfront property, which Trump wants to do through Jared Kushner, they immediately began with funding from Tehran and Qatar to build what would eventually become, over that period of time, 2007, 2023, some 300 kilometers of tunnels. 300 kilometers of tunnels under 365 square kilometers of land. How do you do that? I mean, the place was completely lacerated with tunnels, some of them as deep as 20 meters below the surface of the earth. And at least down south, 9 major tunnels along that 11-kilometer border between Sinai and Gaza, all paid by Qatar, with a blind eye by Egypt. How can a sovereign nation who owns Egypt, or who owns the Sinai, possibly not be aware of the fact that there were massive tunnels being dug 20 meters below the surface, some of them as long as 10 kilometers or 15 kilometers. So that fateful day, the 7th of October, it was long in the planning, and it was extremely well conceived. In fact, it was the perfect storm. It had been in the planning for about 3 years. And as those of you who know something about Middle East politics and Arab politics, the Arabs have always had problems trying to defeat Israel because they've never been coordinated. They've never been able to get their act together. But this time, the proxies of Iran, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, as well as Hamas and other terrorist proxies, got together, agreed to a leader, and agreed to a chain of command and a leadership structure, and they began to plan. And they began to plan on when they would do this, when it would hurt Israel the most, when Israel was weakest, perhaps complacent, a degree of hubris. They began to think about where they were going to attack and how they would train their forces. And they did so. And it was 3 years in the planning. Because some 2,700 Gazans cross into Israel, or were crossing into Israel every day to work on the kibbutzim along the border with Gaza, they had eyes on target. And so they were able to go back to Gaza and report on the layout, the exact layout of all those kibbutzim they were going to. And so they built scale models, and they rehearsed, and they practiced, and they thought through how they would do this. And on the day, they did what they did almost every day. They fired rockets into Israel, because it was almost a daily occurrence. And the daily SOP by the Jews, Israelis in the kibbutzim, was to go to their bunkers. And every house had a little safe room, and then there was a bunker as well. So they go to the safe room, eventually to the bunker. And of course, those 2,500 rockets on the 7th of October caused them all to do that. It's while they were there, hunkering down in the bunkers, that they were attacked and surprised. And in many cases, those bunkers became their sarcophagus. And so they also used huge amounts of deception. Another one, in addition to the rockets, was that they prepositioned individuals to cut off the power lines to the surveillance units that were lined up between the border between Gaza and Israel. They also cut off the generators. And so all of those surveillance units, all women units, all young ladies wearing uniform in the IDF, because the Israelis discovered a long time ago, the IDF, that women, and the women here would be pleased to hear this, are more meticulous than men in terms of surveillance. They pick up on details more than men. They pay more attention to that. And as a result, those surveillance units were populated by women. They went blank. They couldn't see anymore because there was no power, and all their electronics were shot. They then bulldozed their way into Israel. Don't forget, along that 11-kilometer border at 100 different places, and there were an estimated 6,000 terrorists, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other groups, followed closely behind by Gazans who were there to loot and to plunder and to pick up anything to get back, and also to assist with getting the hostages back into Gaza. And they used paragliders as well. So really, it completely surprised Israel. Because it was a special holiday, first of all, the Sabbath, and also a very important holiday in Israel, it took a lot of time for people to react. And as I said, it was the perfect storm. The leaders, the subordinate leaders, were excellent. They had good command and control at the tactical level. In fact, they were wearing GoPro cameras. Every single one of those 6,000 terrorists were wearing GoPro cameras. They were not wearing face masks. They were that brazen because they thought they could pull this off. And yeah, excellent deception. They basically, in most cases, were able to massacre the Jews living inside those kibbutzim in their shelters. So that was the first thing we were exposed to that Monday morning on the 1st of September, was a 48-minute video of the total butchery that took place that morning. It was horrible. We had people like Chris Ryan, the staff sergeant in the British SAS, who during the first Gulf War went scud hunting with his patrol. He was the only one in that 8-man patrol who was able to get out. 4 were killed and 3 were captured. He was there. He's seen his share of violence. We had a lieutenant colonel retired in the Delta Force, U.S. Delta Force, the elite Delta Forces, and many others who'd actually been involved in combat and seen brutality and horrific scenes before in their lives. And after the 48-minute movie, we all walked out for coffee and we all looked at each other with blank looks. Didn't have much to say for a few minutes, but we all agreed that, in fact, we had never, in our experiences, wherever they were in the world, to include Baghdad, to include Basra, to include Kabul, to include Kandahar, Helmand province, and so on and so forth, seen anything quite like this. It was as if it had been done with glee. The Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists actually loved doing what they did that day. Then, right after the movie, and by the way, that 48-minute video is available. I spoke to the Israeli Defense Attaché in Ottawa, and he told me that he is prepared to travel. He's the guy who's the custodian, only he's allowed to show it, but he would be prepared to do so if at some point in time you would be interested in seeing it. But trust me, you don't want to have dinner before seeing it. We spoke to then Brigadier General Dan Goldfuss, who was the commander of the division which was operating in the city of Gaza itself from the outset of this operation. So he'd been in combat nonstop since the 8th of October there when they invaded. And that was 11 months later. Very impressive man, about 6'4", and he's a soldier, as you can see. There he is, dressed as a soldier. He's carrying a rifle, just like his soldiers do. And he told us, he explained to us the difficulty they faced going into the city of Gaza, where you're fighting a 3-dimensional war. You're not only synchronizing the air-land battle, but you're synchronizing the air-land and underground battle in time and space, block by block by block. And it took them a while to get that. They didn't understand the tunnel system. They had no idea there were 300 kilometers worth of tunnels and how they were built and so on and so forth. And as a result, they would advance 2 blocks and find themselves ambushed from the rear by the Hamas terrorists coming up to the surface and attacking them from the rear. They literally wrote the doctrine on urban warfare with the tunnel dimension, and it is now a doctrinal manual in the Israeli Defense Forces, which they had to do because they had nothing to rely on. And he said it's not just that, it wasn't just the tunnels, but it's the fact that they don't wear uniforms. The only time you see Hamas in uniforms is for the ceremonial events when they parade the Israeli hostages or whatever. And so hidden amongst the people, using innocent civilians as shields, both offensively and defensively, and the challenges that he faced doing that. He was also quite open about the fact that it was a catastrophic failure of the national security institutions, and it was also a catastrophic failure of the military command response to the situation, because it was a holiday and because they'd become complacent. And one of the reasons they'd become complacent is that they believed that after all those years, those 2 decades of being enriched, the leadership of Hamas had decided that they might as well keep the Gazans poor to draw international attention to them, and therefore portray Gaza as a place that has to be supported. That all the aid was being translated into money that went into their pockets. In fact, the political leader of Hamas had been living in a luxury apartment in Qatar for 4 years, worth about $4 billion of personal wealth. So that they decided that they didn't want direct confrontation with Israel, they just wanted the status quo. But they'd failed to pick up on those quotes by Iranians and others, like Xinhua, saying that we must tear the hearts out of every Jew and Jew's body. And so that's why perhaps that 7th of October, things didn't go quite the way they were supposed to. He said that if you go to Gaza, and he said he thought we were going to look at all the mosques, look at the schools, look at the homes, look everywhere, cemeteries, and those are where the shafts are. And so every battalion commander in Hamas, his home had a shaft on the ground floor going down to a tunnel that would then connect to the major tunnel system that would take him to his command post or to a weapons manufacturing facility all underground. The elaborate nature of these tunnels was just amazing. And then he showed us a clip about how they would actually send recce teams ahead. But the recce teams were dogs. And these are dogs that had earphones on and radios and a camera on top of their heads. And they'd run down a tunnel, and the dog handler on the surface would look at where the dog's going, and if a dog came to a Y junction, he's looking around, and then he looked to the right and he saw something on the wall, an eyepiece or an IED, the dog handler would say, turn right, and the dog would turn right. That's how they were able to actually clear out so many of these tunnels, eventually, when they started to understand the tunnel system. Just phenomenal, all part of that new doctrine that they required. And although we can actually differentiate between Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the average Gazan, basically a slave living within that space, that small space, at the end of the day, there's no way, he said, that anybody above the age of 10 in Gaza didn't know that these tunnels were being dug. That afternoon, we went off down south to the border with Gaza, and one of the positions that we saw was the Al IDF surveillance camp. So it was one of the posts that was overrun by Hamas that day. Like I said, operated by a woman-only unit. Unit 414, commanded by a 20-year-old young lady, a junior NCO. She repeatedly reported to her superiors for a 4-month period prior to the 7th of October that there were highly unusual activities taking place on the other side of the border in Gaza. And she has since reported, because she did survive, that they failed to take notice of this or take her seriously. They just thought it was just the hysterical cryings of a young girl who really did understand the overall picture and so on and so forth. Again, one of the reasons why the 7th of October occurred and why there was such a failure. Again, as I said, the surveillance equipment was neutralized, and they were repeatedly raped. In some cases, raped while being knifed, passed around, and then put into a bunker, incinerated, a bunker which we had the misfortune of having to visit. And then after visiting that outpost, we went to one of the kibbutzim, where you can see there, they were just shooting people, cutting off their heads, raping men and women, sometimes before killing them, sometimes after. There's a recording of this, because the GoPro cameras were actually being recorded. But this guy, this terrorist, this young fella at this kibbutz, picks up the phone of the woman he just massacred, murdered, and phones his dad. And then he says, pass me on to mom. And look what the mom said. Oh, my son, God bless you. I wish I was with you. Having the blood of 10 Jewish whores, as he called them. So a lot of these guys had no combat experience whatsoever, but they've been training. And you could take any normal individual, and after 2 months of training in close quarter combat, they've become pretty adept. But the tactical commanders were very good. And you could hear this in this 48-minute video that we saw. You can hear the tactical commanders telling their subordinates to stop wasting ammunition, because they wouldn't just put a bullet through the head of a Jewish resident in the kibbutz. They'd actually fire about a burst of 20 rounds just for the fun of it. And the scary bit is that not the soldiers, not the foot soldiers, but the junior leadership had been given maps, marked maps, and told that they were engaged in a 4-week operation which would take them out to the outskirts of Tel Aviv and Judea, Samaria, which we call the West Bank. We then went to the site of the Supernova Rock Festival. You've seen videos of this and pictures of this, which was taking place. Started the evening of the 6th, and they danced all night through the 6th into the 7th of October, when rockets started to fall. And at 6:30 in the morning, when the rockets flew overhead, they didn't care, because they knew it always happened, so who cares? Until all of a sudden things started to actually fall apart. Actually, that supernova location was where the worst carnage took place. 378 killed and 44 taken hostage into Gaza. So, to actually bring this closer to home, if you take the population of Israel and you compare it to the population proportionally of the United States of America, what happened on the 7th of October 2023 was the equivalent of some 44,400 Americans being killed by terrorists in a day, around 15 9/11s. Okay, 9/11, big deal, 15 times that. And the kidnap toll would have been about 10,000 Americans, and even closer to home, if it was us, it would be the equivalent to 5,000 Canadians being killed in a single day and 1,000 taken hostage. That is the trauma that materialized in the minds, in the eyes of Israel the morning of the 7th, throughout the day, throughout the horrific day, the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th, as the news got worse and worse and worse. We were concerned about the legality of the operations being conducted by the Israeli Defense Forces, and they knew that, and we wanted to hear what their rules of engagement were, recognizing that national rules of engagement are classified secret. I was very surprised, they were very frank with us and walked through the various portions of the rules of engagement for their operations in Gaza as they were being conducted. And this lawyer said the problem we've got is that you cannot differentiate between a terrorist and a civilian because they don't wear uniforms. They all look the same. It's very difficult. And they build everything in and amongst the civilian population. It's inextricably linked into the population. Human shields, when they conduct offensive operations, very often what they'll do is they'll use them, and they would approach the Israeli Defense Forces as close as they could, and then there's a firefight, and of course the civilians are killed. And also offensively are dead switches or dead man switches, where you have a young boy, 8 years old. He's got a switch in his hand, and it's activated when it's released. And so the little boy goes towards an Israeli patrol. The Hamas sniper shoots the boy in the head. The switch is released, and then the explosive kills the patrol. And they said, after having gone through the rules of engagement, that yes, there have been excesses. And there was disproportionate use of force in some cases, and that there were more than 1,000 cases being processed by the IDF legal authorities as well as the government authorities, legal authorities, with a view to ensuring that those who had misbehaved and had not followed the rules of engagement, who had lost their heads, who had overreacted to a tactical situation, would be processed accordingly. we went to see the Director General of Shin Bet, which is a big deal actually, because Shin Bet is the US equivalent to the FBI or the UK MI5, as opposed to Mossad, MI6, and so on and so forth, CIA. And they're very secretive. To get into there was more difficult than to get into the National Defense Headquarters in Tel Aviv. And a very blunt man said, well, they weren't wearing masks because they thought they were superheroes, but my guarantee to all of you here today is I will hunt them down and we will actually get rid of them, every single one of them. And they have. That guy was boasting about having the blood of 10 Jewish whores on his hands. Yeah, he got it. He's no longer amongst the living. We were very fortunate, as I mentioned, that we were the first foreign delegation to be able to drive down the Philadelphia corridor on the 7th of October in Humvees, which is a lot of fun. And quite frankly, as a former soldier, I was kind of pleased to see real soldiers again in action. And I have to say that the division commanders, the brigade commanders that we met were incredibly competent, spoke well. They get it, but it's their soldiers that really impressed me. They walk confidently. They're not cocky. There's no bravado, but you can see self-confidence and maturity, and they were actually very professional. And the way they were equipped and the way they carried themselves, it was impressive to see. So what the senior individual who was on our delegation was retired General Sir John McCall, and here you see him with the Deputy Commander of the 162nd Division, which is the division that was working in the Rafah area at the time. John McCall actually was a classmate of mine in Camberley in the UK, and when I met him at Charles de Gaulle Airport, it was the first time I'd seen him in 40 years. He did very well, a lot better than I did. He got 4 stars. He commanded a combat division in Iraq during the first Gulf War. He commanded the first ISAF mission when it didn't even belong to NATO, and he retired as Deputy TSAC Europe, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. And so a very balanced individual in terms of assessing what we saw, as well as several other generals. So as we drove down the Philadelphia corridor, we would stop every 700 meters or so, and we were shown the tunnels, the 9 tunnels that they had uncovered over those 11 months, and those are the ones that they had uncovered. And in some cases 20 meters deep, in some cases you could drive a 2.5-ton truck through them. So the rockets arrived in the Sinai by ship, dropped off by Iran. They're then picked up by trucks that drive through, blatantly, brazenly, through the Sinai, Egyptian sovereign territory, through the tunnels, under the border between Egypt and Gaza, and into Gaza to be stored away. We were also exposed to food shipments, and that's been a big deal all along. And we saw what must have been a sea of 100 trucks, all laden like this. The problem there is that the IDF control the border at the Rafah crossing, but once inside Gaza, it's estimated that 80% of the food and humanitarian supplies that are on those trucks are skimmed off by Hamas and then resold to the Gazans, or kept for themselves so that they could feed themselves, stay healthy and fit and fat. The young colonel that you saw there with Sir John McCall, their rank system is different from ours. Their brigades are commanded by colonels, and their divisions are commanded by brigadier generals. And so this deputy division commander, or colonel, walked us through how they were working in Rafah. And it was a block by block, tortuous affair. This is September, and with helmet on and our flak jackets that we were wearing, it was extremely hot. they're in those tunnels, they're in those they're fighting on the streets, block by block for 12 hours at a time, saying that it's block by block that we go. There's always warning. They'd be warned. A series of blocks would be warned several days in advance by loud horns and communications, leaflets, and so on and so forth to evacuate. They would actually text them even, use landline, every possible means with the view to doing that, to include a thing called roof knocking, which I wasn't familiar with. It's where you tell them that if you hear a projectile hit the top corner of your house, then you know that within 3 hours we will be inside that house, so leave. And so it's that kind of methodical approach to taking one block at a time, using indoor drones. These little drones would go in, they fly in through a broken window, and then all of a sudden they see an eye, a camera, and they know they're being watched. And then they turn around, they see a 45-gallon drum with dead cord coming out of it, so you have to know what that is. And so they were able to avoid a huge number of casualties that way, but they estimated that about half of the destruction at that point in time, at that snapshot in time, was caused by Hamas and not just the IDF. Look at the way this guy's equipped. We're very fortunate to have a session with the defense minister at the time, Gallant, who has subsequently been removed. He told us that their aim is not just to kill Hamas, because basically they're an ideology, but it was to create the conditions whereby they would be able to dismantle the ability of Hamas to actually govern inside Gaza, as well as not be able to conduct military operations. The problem they were having though, is that they realized it would take years to do this, but security without governance governance without security doesn't exist. And so the big problem was governance. And I'll come back to that when I talk about the Palestinian Authority and what their thinking is in terms of Jews. But he said the Palestinian Authority is not an option. And right now we've got a problem. Who's going to provide the security force to do this? And so he said this will take time. They are very keen and have been talking to the Gulf states, and they still are talking to the UAE, Saudi Arabia, to Qatar. But at the end of the day, it's a delicate thing because they will only accept to work more closely with Israel on this, provided Israel accepts a two-state solution. And we talk about Tehran providing funding for Hamas, but at the end of the day, Qatar probably funds, or were funding Hamas to the tune of $300 billion per month, which is 3 times more than Tehran was providing. So basically every month Hamas was getting $500 million in funding. It's interesting that the ICC in November last year issued a warrant for Gallant and Netanyahu on the same sheet of paper almost as the 3 Hamas leaders for alleged war crimes and so on and so forth. At that point in time, there was no indication to us that the way that the IDF was conducting operations was in any way out of control. We received a lecture from a gentleman named Itamar Marcus, who runs an organization called Palestinian Media Watch. And basically, and I know I'm over time here, but I'll hurry up. You'll see as this slide builds that they are hell-bent on educating the youth, the Palestinian youth, that Jews must be eradicated from the surface of the earth. Human waste, Satan in human form. To kill Jews is an Islamic imperative, and it's not. pounded into your mind from 4 years of age. By the time you're 7, you're a lost cause. You cross the line. And not only this, is that Hamas terrorists who are captured, or Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists who are captured and are in detention in Israel, the families receive a monthly stipend. Yeah, so that massacre on the 7th of October, a morning of joy, victory, and pride. So we were convinced that based on this, if indeed that is exactly what is the case, and certainly we weren't there long enough to be able to assess that, is that they're the source of the problem and certainly not a governance option for Gaza post the day after. And I say the day after because when we met with the defense minister, I asked him the question, I said, so what are your options for the post-conflict period of time? Post-conflict, what are you going to pursue? And he said, well, we call that the day after. But for the moment, at this point in time, they really don't have many options. We had a 2-hour meeting at the end of the week with Bibi Netanyahu. As I was saying to some of you earlier on, very impressive man. I'd met him back in 1989 when he was somewhat younger looking, and I guess I was too. But very charismatic, strong-willed, strong character, and he's totally focused. And I just circled that lady at the end of the table there because she's the Right Honourable Joan Ryan, a former MP and a minister in the UK. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the organization that sponsored us for that visit. So in our discussion with the Prime Minister, he covered a strategic picture for us, but this is what Sir John McCall told him in his own words. And it is the fact both Goldfuss and the Deputy Division Commander down in Rafah told us that we have aborted missions when we knew that there were civilians inside buildings or building blocks inside the cities, whether it be Gaza City, Han Yunis, or Rafah down south. I made the point that having seen their rules of engagement and having seen the rules of engagement for coalition operations in Iraq, as well as ISAF in Afghanistan, we were happy, we were satisfied, and the group was satisfied that theirs were more strict than ours had been. And you look at the CIV-CAS combatant ratios, and the UN has estimated over the decades that the ratio is 9 to 1. They estimate in Gaza is 2 to 1. It was 3 to 1 in Afghanistan, 4 to 1 in Iraq. But in reality, when the Hamas run health authority in Gaza reports figures, they include their own figures. They always exaggerate them, and after having exaggerated them a few weeks later, when there's no longer any media attention, they reduce the numbers. But half the casualties that have taken place in Gaza, at least half, were terrorists. We told them that we were happy with the delivery of humanitarian assistance. As long as it was under their control, things happened. The moment it entered Gaza, things fell apart. But they couldn't deal with that. Another point I made with the Prime Minister is that they were losing the media war, and that they had to educate Western world leaders, not just talk to them, but actually sit down with them in person and take them around Gaza, take them down the corridor, and show them what was going on, and making them understand that in fact it wasn't just Israel, its peril, it's the West. And we've seen attacks by Hamas terrorists and other organizations in Europe recently. The generals are so impressive, we said, get your generals out there. Just don't put your public affairs officer there, and not just politicians. It's important to get the soldiers, the real soldiers out there. In fact, in my army, I found that very often it's the sergeants that are more convincing than the officers. another point I made is use the Zelensky approach that Israel is the first line of defense for the West against Iran and its proxies, just like Ukraine is first line of defense against Russia. Open Gaza up, get them in there. And there was talk about, at the time, they were talking about a ceasefire, and the ownership of the Philadelphia corridor was a topic of contention. And he said, I don't want to give it up. And we said, well, don't give it up. And certainly don't give it up to a UN organization like UNIFIL in southern Lebanon, which has been part of the problem as well, as opposed to part of the solution all these years, and they're still there. And Israel, since its inception, has been at war. It's an incredible climate. It's just unbelievable to actually live there. We get out of a luxury hotel in Tel Aviv, walk over to the restaurant at the breakfast room, and as we look out at the beach, there are young men and women in their skimpy bathing suits, surfing, swimming, and so on and so forth, having a great time. An hour and a half south, they're dying and they're fighting nonstop. And it's a funny climate, but it permeates every aspect of their lives. And they feel that, and they really do feel it. And so that was my departure, where they're still looking at photos of the ones that were still in captivity. I could have gone on much longer, but I think I've bored you enough. And certainly, if you were willing to listen to some, if you want to ask questions, I'm more than willing to do so.
Well, you can't run your own, right? I mean, General, first of all, thank you so much. This has been absolutely tremendous. I mean, I have been there myself on 2 occasions, and as an MP, I was there to examine the war on Gaza in 2014, which is not this war.
No.
But even then, the Israelis would give tremendous warning. They're going to take down a building, it's got a rocket factory in the basement of it. They'd send leaflets first saying, we're going to take down this building. An hour later, they'll send a benign explosive saying, we're going to take down this building, and 3 hours later, they finally take it down. So they do try very hard to get civilians out of the way. But in this case, I think the one thing Israel lost in this war is the information war. The Hamas, has been far more successful, perhaps with Qatari support and others, in being able to win not only just the news broadcast but social media. I mean, that's why you see so many people on the street, with Palestinian flags and scarves and so on and so forth. So perhaps, what is your comment on the Israelis, in fact, losing the social media war? Because you are right. I think the numbers are actually, if you really correct the numbers to what they are in terms of casualties, they're much lower than what is reported by the UN and others. And in fact, Hamas thrives on casualties, right? They thrive on putting human shields in front of them. They don't care. As far as they're concerned, everybody's born to be a martyr. And so this is some of the problem. And so perhaps you might want to comment on Israel's inability to capitalize on social media.
When they were planning this operation that was launched on the 7th of October, they had brainstormed what they thought the Israeli reaction would be. And they were convinced the Israeli reaction would be eventually overwhelming use of force, and perhaps disproportionate use of force. And so they were counting on that to win international public support for Gaza, not necessarily Hamas. But then again, the health authority that reports the casualties in Gaza is run by Hamas. So why would you not expect the figures to be inflated, lied about, and then eventually retracted a few days later? So they anticipated this, and several have been, Hamas leaders have been talked about the media, interviewed, and they make the point. They said, we have won a strategic victory. We did on the 7th of October, it was a strategic victory because we got Israel to do what they've done, and everybody is sorry about the poor Gazans. And so it was a very difficult humanitarian issue to deal with for the Israeli government and the IDF, given that the public was so overwhelmingly taken by the plight of these poor people who are subjugated by an organization that actually looks forward to mass Gazan casualties as opposed to protecting the Gazans, because it puts them in the limelight as being the protectors of Gazans. So this has been the difficult issue they've had to wrestle with and have not been as successful as they should have been. And as I say, based on what we saw in September last year and the way they were conducting themselves then, there have been now some pretty intense airstrikes, pretty intense operations, which indicate to me, but again, unless you're there, you never know, that they are perhaps using a great deal more force than they used to back in the days when we were there. But back then, the international media should have been there. They should have actually accompanied Israeli forces, watched and listened to how they were conducting themselves, and perhaps be more balanced in their reporting, which they have not been. Yes, please, Eric.
This troubles me a lot, and what troubles me is, are we handicapped by the fact that we automatically assume that everybody is dealing in good faith?
Pardon me?
Are we handicapped by our presumption that all sides are dealing in good faith? Because I see that in our Prime Minister, and I don't think he's got his head around that yet.
No, it's an interesting point you make, because I've spoken to two Jewish groups in Kingston, a small group, but in June, the Jewish community got together, and there must have been about 130 of them in the audience. And I tailored my presentation for Jews, so they could understand that perspective. And they came to see me afterwards and said, it's interesting because my daughter, who's going to a high school here in Toronto, or wherever, Kingston, or is going to university in Toronto, feels threatened when she goes to university. She's Jewish, and so she wants to go back to Israel, where she feels safer in Israel than living in Toronto, in terms of how they are received and perceived publicly now because of this lost media battle. Because, as you know, and as we teach in our staff colleges now, the strategic communications, public relations, public affairs dimension battle is as important as the kinetic one in operations today. And we failed miserably in Afghanistan as well.
Well, go ahead. No.
Oh, sorry.
I was just wondering, sir, in Gaza, do the Israelis have the equivalent of CIMIC, civil military cooperation? Is there any local forces that will, once the Israelis have advanced past them, will engage with the Israelis and work with them? Is there any civic engagement like that?
No, there isn't.
Yes, sir.
No.
Ted, I'm in charge.
Okay, Kennedy.
I'm in charge of the questions, Ted.
Oh, all right.
Sit down. No, sit down, Robert.
Sit, stay.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Sir, you told us that the reports from the borderline.
Sir, can you back up just a little bit so you can be on camera? Thank you.
That the reports from the units, surveillance units along the border of Gaza were routinely being dismissed, which would be part of the answer. But I'm wondering if you got any more insight into the general intelligence failure in the months leading up to this of the IDF.
Well, don't forget, they're fighting on the multi-front war. So they're very much focused on Hezbollah as well in southern Lebanon. And it's interesting that Brigadier General Dan Goldfuss, now Major General Dan Goldfuss, as soon as he got his second star, was immediately sent to command the northern front against Hezbollah. And at the time we didn't know it, but he's the guy who actually commanded or launched the campaign that went into southern Lebanon, because he's probably a future chief of defense staff. He is. And so at the end of the day, there was very much a Hezbollah focus, and they believed, like I said, it was growing complacency at the strategic pole level within Israel amongst the political leadership, the senior civil servants, and the military, that we just don't think that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad got the heart, the leadership, to actually go through this pain because they're too well off. Life is good. Keep the Gazans poor and begging, and we'll just enjoy life and send our children overseas to school, get educated, and live the good life with our millions of dollars and billions and so on. And status quo just continues. They believe that. It was that complacency. And they call it something like conception. It was a thought that they had that it just won't happen. And so these reports by junior people repeatedly didn't seem to get up to the senior levels. But there is also, I heard at some point that one of the senior level Mossad operators in Israel had a lady had reported to her boss that she thought there was something happening, but again, it was dismissed because it wasn't believed to be built on factual evidence.
And they're dismissing things like all of those trucks crossing the Sinai and
Yeah. And the thing is, there was a growing degree of evidence, but nobody seemed to pick up on it.
Okay, we've come to after 8:30. Two more questions, and I get the last one. Ted, you're obviously very insistent.
I'm
Go
very
ahead.
insistent, very insistent. But on the tunnels, I mean, the tunnels are something to behold. There are 300, this is not the Great Escape, right? There's 300 kilometers of tunnels here. And some, as you said, could take a deuce and a half up the side, and some of them that are just tracks. But I mean, these tunnels had to be built out of something. They built out of aid, UN aid, things like this. Somebody had to provide all this concrete that was meant to build infrastructure at schools, but instead turned into tunnels.
Yep, and again, all the materials brought in either by trucks, covered with food, or through the tunnels that were built between Sinai and Gaza, meticulously dug. And these are not just your average dirt tunnel. A lot of them were lined in concrete. Don't forget 300 kilometers of tunnels. Think about the logistics. Think about water, electricity, power, and ventilation. And they had power and they had ventilation in the tunnels, and so they had lighting as well. And then because there are so many shafts throughout, I mean, basically that 365 kilometers, square kilometers, it is one built-up area almost, with only a few agricultural areas. And so there were lots of opportunities for the shafts to go down to be able to lower water down and so on and so forth. The logistics were a major operation, and in some cases, the Hamas operators would be living down there for 2-3 weeks at a time. But most of the movement between locations in Gaza was done through the tunnels, and they would pop up only to actually execute an operation or ambush an Israeli patrol or resupply themselves or give orders and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sir, why don't you sit down for a minute and I'll ask you. I'm going to ask you the last question, which is going to be a hard one. I mean, you are an expert planner, you're an expert strategist, you're an expert understanding of the comprehensive approach of the interrelationship of defense diplomacy and development. There is a theorist who's been around for a while, and I apologize to him because I can't think of his first name, but his last name is Galtung, Galtung. And he proposed a theory of what he called positive and negative peace. And I'll simplify it. So a negative peace is when the shooting stops, but the underlying causes of the conflict have not actually been resolved. And positive peace is where, for some reason, the underlying causes of the conflict have been resolved. So a good example of the latter would be the destruction of Nazi Germany in 1945. Not only were they militarily defeated, ultimately the very concept of Nazism was defeated through the denazification process, through the Nuremberg trials. And as a result, we now have a Germany today that is a member of the Western Alliance, a very successful economy, and a democracy. On the other hand, you might have something like the Koreans, where you have a negative piece in the sense that there's no longer fighting between North and South Korea, but the war is technically not over, and there's still a tremendous amount of competition, animosity, and potential conflict between those two countries. Having said all that, what do you think it's going to take? Because we now have had, what, a week of a ceasefire, which is barely holding on? What do you think would allow the scenario, as we see it today, between Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, to actually resolve this conflict in terms of a true positive peace? And if you can answer that, you'll be the next UN Director General.
A regime change in Iran.
Okay.
Okay, so Iran, I'd say 60% of the population or more in Iran are desirous of Western values and Western customs and a Western way of life. And it is only the repressive regime which is keeping the lid on this. But I believe that over time there can be a gradual shift whereby the regime in Iran is more tolerant and is more willing to actually work with the West in a constructive way, because only they will then be in a position to be able to deal with the atrocities that they have nurtured over these years. A regime that has, don't forget, when you call Israel a colonial implant in the Middle East, the biggest colonial people in the Middle East right now are the regime in Tehran. Look at Hezbollah in Lebanon back in the 1980s and 90s. Look at 2003, how Iran set itself up inside Iraq post Saddam Hussein and basically govern indirectly and dominate the government of Iraq. Look at Yemen, the Houthis, that they went to the rescue. Look at the support of the Syrian regime under Assad, supported and basically, he was the puppet of Tehran. So it's that influence that has to be erased, and it starts from within, and then you deal with the outer reaches, so on and so forth. A political peace is the only solution to any conflict, we know that. In Afghanistan, I would hear these American generals talk about, we're going to kill ourselves out of this war. I said, well, how are you going to kill all the Taliban that are being mass produced inside Pakistan in those ultra, madrasas that are just producing hatred for the West? Essentially, what you've got to do is, you're not going to kill all the Taliban that can be produced, because you'll never do it. You'll run out of bullets. You have to actually get that regime, the Taliban, to actually talk to the government in Kabul. And to make that happen, you have to again work with Islamabad with a view to getting them to stop supporting the ISI, who are directly training the Taliban to kill American, Canadian, German soldiers with our taxpayers. That's what was happening. Our taxpayers' money going to Islamabad was then being funneled up to the ISI, who were training the Taliban to kill us. So you've got to deal with the cause, and you've got to deal with the cause politically with a view to bringing an end to the fight.
Thank you so much. Well, General, you've given us, as I kind of suspected you would, a tour de force here tonight, which is why we asked you to come. You're not getting away with just one visit, and we're going to be having you back for something else in the very near future. We hope.
And a tour.
And a tour.
Yes, and a tour.
Yes. So on behalf of the Royal Canadian Military Institute and the Defence and Security Studies program, and all of our membership and those who could be here tonight, and also all those who will see you online, because we, as you see, we videotape these presentations, and many more people will undoubtedly want to see what you have provided to us this evening. So on behalf of all those people, you've done a great service for us tonight, but you've done a great service for Canada, and you've done a great service for the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.